Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our look at the forces in World War II and some of the minorities that made up those armies. And as always, I'm still debating whether or not minorities was the right title for it. It's just about units that made up a smaller than larger part of any force in World War II. But it's the idea is to tackle what some of these units faced and attitudes and prejudices and experiences and things like that. So today is our only show this week that looks at the Eastern Front and the Red Army, or the forces from the Soviet Union, which of course drew people in from a vast geographic and area with huge cultural differences and backgrounds and language. And to help us wade through this mess of nations is Brandon Schechter, who is a professor at Columbia University and has written a book, the link is in the description below, called The Stuff of Soldiers, a book about the Red Army through a collection of objects. So he has also taught in and visited Russia and the Soviet Union and experienced that side of it from their archive. So I'm going to bring him into the show now. So good afternoon, Brandon. How are you today?
I'm great, Paul. How are you?
Very well. So the Red Army, I just said it there, huge, complex organization that is not even at the same at the end of the war as it was at the beginning of the war. I mean, it's an evolving organization that brings people in from all over the Soviet Union and indeed elsewhere as they move in towards Berlin and Germany. So where does your interest, or where did your interest in this begin, and trying to kind of understand how it's made up of different types of people? What is it that intrigued you about this aspect of it?
So, I mean, really, I was fascinated living in Russia and learning Russian as an undergraduate. I became immediately apparent how important language is, how important understanding what's going on culturally is, and I began to realize that there's a significant portion of the Red Army that are from different cultures, many of whom, as I'll talk about today later in the talk, do not really have a mastery of the Russian language, and they're having to learn how to be soldiers in a situation in which all commands are given in Russian, all instruction is given in Russian. So, you know, as a result of this, I became interested in that. I've always been interested in just socialism in general. I've been interested in the Soviet Union, particularly the Eastern Front, because, you know, it's the largest conflict in recorded human history. And I just want to give a little bit of a sense of the scale of what's going on here. The Red Army is the largest army in recorded human history. You know, 34.5 million people passed through its ranks in the course of the war. At least 8.6 million of those people die. It's usually about 11 million people in arms at any one time, about half of which are on the active front. And because of these heavy losses, in part because of these heavy losses, in part because of just design, because of the way that Soviet society is shaped, this is an army that reflects the society from which it's drawn, much more so than the average army that is basically young men, overwhelmingly. And what happens in the Soviet case is they bring in between 500,000 and 800,000 women. And on the eve of the war, who can serve in the army gets expanded dramatically. And in the course of the war, who can serve gets expanded dramatically, as well as various class restrictions on who could serve in the army are taken away as a million people leave the Gulag system in order to serve in the army, mostly petty criminals. So, you know, because a couple of things I want to just kind of point out here, and I'll start. You don't want to look at my face, you want to look at the slides, is that this war is the first war that the Soviet Union fights in which there is a universal draft. The universal draft, well, arguably the Winter War is, but the Winter War is kind of also part of the Second World War. 1939 is the first all-union draft. So there are many nationalities that this is the first time that they are subjected to the draft, and I'll talk more about that later. But I am going to start off talking about women and a little bit of background about what we need to know about the Soviet state. And I just want to say in general, in my own work, and today's talk is a little bit from my book, but a lot more from side projects that I've done, specifically on women and specifically on non-Russians. And I'll explain the awkwardness of that term in a moment. I highlight the voices of women and non-Russians because they are integrating into a largely masculine and largely Slavic institution of the Red Army. Before the war, the primary base of the Red Army was Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. And they, in many ways, they highlight, their experiences highlight, and they are sensitive to things that other soldiers might miss. And also the general experience of having your body taken over by the state is something that they experience differently. So just a little bit of background, what you should know about the Soviet state.
Just a quick question for you, Brandon, before you launch into it. You know, we often talk about World War II as being the most documented war of global war. You know, and the amount of information we have in the National Archives in the USA and Canada and Britain. But in terms of the Red Army, obviously there's restrictions on what archives are available. It still comes up in conversations when I have someone talking about the Eastern Front. Is huge amounts of swathes of material is still not released, and it presumably is going to change given what's going on in the world today, politically and with the war in Ukraine. But in terms of its diversity, I'm assuming there is less material available in Russian archives about the minority aspects than there is, you know, Zhukov and the big generals and the kind of the popular media propaganda type units. Is that the case?
So when I started graduate school, I thought I was going to write a project that was going to be primarily about non-Russians in the Red Army. And I ran into two problems, one of which you've already highlighted, which is archival access. The Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense holds most holdings from 1941 to the present. And people have not been, Western historians have not been getting access for quite some time. The other problem I ran into is a limited facility with language. I kind of realized I should learn about 15 more languages to do this project properly. And I started learning a couple of them, but didn't make the same sort of headway that I had with Russian. But what I did find is essentially when issues of diversity are a problem, they create a paper trail. And right. I will talk today about what I did have access to is the party archives. And there's a lot of discussion in the party archives about how do we deal with diversity. And so one of the things I want to point out in general is the Soviets are very comfortable with improvisation. And the introduction of both women and non-Russian minorities into the Red Army is not something that they've put a lot of thought into until it happens. And they more react to the presence of these people in their ranks than kind of set up policies that will ease them into the ranks. So just like super quick, a couple of things I want you to know about the Soviet Union to keep in mind. While they're a Marxist state who want to basically, you know, create socialism and then eventually go to communism, and class is the primary category that they think about, they do think quite a bit about gender and quite a bit about the nation as a category. And I'll talk about gender first, talk about women first, and then I'll talk about what they think about nations, how they think about diversity in general. In terms of gender, because they are Marxists, and in the Marxist interpretation, essentially women and children are owned by men. They're a form of property under the bourgeois system. So they want to free women from the slavery by integrating them into the workforce. There are a variety of ways in which they imagine replacing the family with the state during the war by taking much of the burden away of taking care of the family, placing that on the state, taking away from women. And the integration of women into the workforce is something that largely happens. Education is also a major aspect. You know, illiteracy is a huge issue, and illiteracy among women is much, but there's literacy among women is much less than literacy among men. But by 1936, they have largely decided that we have resolved most of the issues of gender. We are in an equal society. We've integrated women into the workforce, and we want to bring back certain aspects of traditionalism. So abortion is made illegal. Divorce, which had been very easy to do in the 1920s, is made much more difficult, much more expensive. And just in general, women are viewed, it's explicitly stated that the primary goal of women in society, while they're still working, they're not out of the workforce, but the primary goal is to have children, is to continue the socialist family. And instead of replacing the family, rhetoric in the 30s treats the family as the building block of socialist society. So that's just to give a sense of where we're at. But women are still integrated in the workforce in a way that is not quite like, in a way that is greater than in a lot of other places. Like Rosie the Riveter is less of a thing in the Soviet context because women had already been in the workforce. There's just a greater integration of women into the workforce. It's not something novel. So we get to the war, and you have classic wartime symbolism, imagining the country as a woman that needs to be defended. We see here the Motherland is Calling poster with the military oath. Fear of rape and murder is something that is very strong and very real. And one of the interesting things, if you look at Soviet versus American or German propaganda during the war and just things that are produced for soldiers, is the absence of sexualization in the Soviet context. There's no pinups. The only discussions of sex are that the Germans will rape the people that you care about if you lose, and that women will not touch men who have not become heroes during the war. Like this is a major aspect of this propaganda. So it's very different than, like, you look at German manuals, they're often semi-pornographic. If you look at the US stuff, there's all this kind of flirtatious sexualization. So again, we're in a society that is not talking frankly about sex. But we're in a society in which women have been integrated, but which is also kind of flirting with some more traditional gender roles. And this is the context in which women are mobilized into the army. As Anna Krylova has shown in her work, women entering the army in 1941 are largely doing so by specially requesting to join the army. These are often women who have some sort of special skills, special training from pre-war programs aimed at teaching people how to shoot, how to provide first aid, how to jump out of planes, that sort of stuff. And thus the women who enter the military are often better educated. They're often more skilled. In the course of the war, certain branches of service become dominated by women: traffic control, communications, anti-aircraft, certain medicine and logistics become dominated by women. There's a special sniper school set up for women outside of Moscow. And I'll mention some of the people involved with that in a moment. Special aviation regiments of women, including the famous Night Witches, who flew biplanes at night and dropped bombs. This is the largest use of women in combat that I think has happened in terms of a single conflict. But again, it's introduced without an overall policy. Initially, women are volunteering and either being allowed to volunteer or not. Beginning in the spring of 1942, there are a series of orders that call for the replacement of men in rear area services by women. Similar to the kind of the release a man to fight rhetoric of the various U.S. Army formations made up of women. And there is no general policy. Everything is being negotiated. So what do you do about hair? Well, in some cases, women have their head shaved. In other cases, they can negotiate with their commanders, keeping long hair as long as they keep lice free. In other places, they're given a specific type of haircut. Women's clothing is highly impractical, but sometimes issued. Like if you're a sniper, you really don't want to be crawling around in a skirt. Medic, same thing. And there's also nothing really provided for women in terms of special underwear. Women talk about improvising bras. And also during the period of menstruation, the military has not looked at this. So it is often the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, which has mobilized most of these women into the military, that kind of serves as various stopgap measures, figuring out these issues that have not been, that the state has not really looked at. What we have here as well is this kind of odd, negotiating femininity and service in the military. So, should a woman try to maintain some aspects of femininity? And for lots of people serving in the military, it's the idea that women civilize the front, an echo of the Общественница movement of the 1930s, which was a movement to kind of bring culture to the workers, and that women in many ways are serving a similar role. But many women are actually very talented combatants, particularly snipers. So Ludmila Pavlichenko, who becomes a very famous sniper serving near Sevastopol, has 309 German soldiers who she's killed, and she's eventually sent to the US, where she befriends Eleanor Roosevelt and is kind of trying to drum up support for the war and the opening of the Second Front. And, you know, press claims that her uniform makes her look fat. People ask her if she's allowed to wear makeup at the front or silk underwear. And she's just kind of like, you guys really don't understand what I do at the front. She responds angrily in Time magazine, quote, "I wear my uniform with honor. It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered with blood and battle. It is plain to see that American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn," end quote. And she kind of becomes increasingly angry in the US at the disconnect between their understanding of what the war experience is and her own lived understanding. As a side note, you know, sniping is considered to be a particularly good task for women because there's a perception that women are more patient than men are. There's a perception that sniping keeps women away from direct hand-to-hand combat, and women are physically weaker, so you want to kind of protect them from that. And there's an irony in this, in that one of the other major tasks that women fulfill at the front is medics, where they have to carry both soldiers and their weapons from the battlefield. So this idea of feminine weakness is kind of completely undone by that. I want to talk about...
Just to interrupt you for a second, Brad. This perception that they've got certain skills they're better at, so sniping things, was that the women who volunteered at the beginning kind of suggesting that perception, or was the perception coming from higher up in the Red Army and filtering down? I'm just intrigued.
I think
whether the volunteers came in with some ideas of what they thought they might be good at.
I think it really has more than anything to do with just kind of elemental ideas about what men and women are like. Right, this idea, and not because a lot of the women who end up being allowed to volunteer randomly at the beginning of the war, some of them end up as machine gunners and artillerists and tank drivers. Not in these particular, not in these. They're not necessarily early on funneled into these particular jobs. So one of the things that because they have not come up with a set policy for how to integrate women into the Red Army, one of the things that they haven't really decided is what are the relationships between men and women supposed to be like? What is allowed and what is not allowed? Essentially, is romance allowed or not? And one of the things that historians of gender have pointed out repeatedly is that the integration of women into a space that before that had been largely a masculine space often leads to ideas that women are not going to be controlled. Women are going to start acting like men. They're going to become promiscuous, so on and so forth, right? And this fear has real consequences in terms of how women experience the war and how they're perceived during the war. So Alexandra Schlechova, who is pictured here, she was one of the graduates from the first class of the Women's Sniper School in Moscow. She was head of its Young Communist organization. She's interviewed at the front in 1944. And she says, quote, "When I was in training, I was dying to get to the front, but I was also afraid. I thought that I would be surrounded by men and it would be a hard life. I feared rape and coercion. They told me that there aren't any girls at the front. No, only women. I was very afraid of this and thought that it could never be. I will leave a girl and return as a girl. I wanted my mama to know that I remained so. And then I thought of my mama. I was simply overcome with fear. I didn't go to the front for that," referring to sex. "And I set myself the goal of not falling in love with anyone at the front." End quote. Schlechova will go on to kill 69 German soldiers. She commands this platoon of female snipers and is their, as I mentioned, their Young Communist League organizer. And she is killed herself in Latvia towards the end of the war. And this dichotomy that she talks about between girls and women is very important to perceptions of women at the front, or female soldiers at the front. This is why I use the term girls in quotes throughout my work, where essentially it's about policing behavior. Girls are encouraged, and girls is the term, devushki in Russian, is the term that you meet in the Soviet press at the time. Very, very seldom when talking about women in the ranks do they use the term zhenshina, woman. And the idea is that the girl is the person who has arrived there to be a soldier. They don't swear, they don't drink, they don't smoke, and most importantly, they don't have sex. And the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, is very much sending, who is at least, 500,000 of the women who are sent into the military are recruited by the Komsomol to go into the military, is sending the message that, no, yeah, romance is something for after the war. We must first win the war. However, the political directorate of the Red Army, also trying to deal with this, comes up with the opposite concept. In July of 1942, after basically party organizations at the front had been going after commanders who were having relationships with their subordinates, Alexander Sherbakov, the commander of the political directorate of the Red Army, basically during a discussion between top-level officials, says the following: if people come together, a commander and a woman, there's nothing extraordinary. Why cause a commotion? Why spy on them and then write, discuss, and investigate? Does the party commission really have nothing else to do? We have to strictly ensure that in a commander's entourage, there is no bitch spy. That type needs to be unmasked and driven out. I don't want people to think that everything is permitted, but we don't need to have our heads in the clouds. We're all grown-ups and should understand what is permissible and what is not, what are normal human relations and what is moral decay. The moral makeup of our commanders, particularly political workers, should be clean. This all has to be understood properly in the manner of the party in a humanistic way, end quote. So essentially, the organization that is sending women to the front is saying romance is something to happen later, but the party is saying we're fine with romantic relationships between commanders and their subordinates. We are not. This is not something that we're going to punish. And what this leads to, because commanders in the Red Army have tremendous authority, their command is the rule of the state, the rule of law. This leads to a situation where many commanders believe that they have a right to the bodies of their female subordinates, and where female soldiers often do not have. They can sometimes appeal to the party organization, but essentially they're at the mercy of the people who are their commanders. In many cases, perhaps most cases, the commanders are fine and they're normal and they are not necessarily sexual predators, but everything is in place for what we would now call sexual harassment. And as one sniper will angrily write to the Komsomol towards the end of the war, quote, "Our female youth has been leased to Komsomol instructors who seem unaware of the scandalous fact that the smallest and the biggest commanders seduce these young fledglings, then themselves scorn them. Some of them have been sent to the rear crippled. I myself have seen this on 3 sections of the front," end quote. But she also expresses anger at, quote, "a certain group of people who conduct themselves in a low, vulgar manner, but the stain falls on everyone." And during the war, there's a kind of a mythological figure who emerges known as the PPZ, the Pohodne Polovaya Zhena, which can be translated as mobile field wife. And the idea that this is a woman in the girls versus woman dichotomy. This is a woman who is having a relationship with her commander. Often the perception is to get out of drudgery duties. Often the idea is there's often a very huge difference in rank and in age. The commander often has a family at home. And the idea is that she's essentially prostituting herself out to get into a better situation. And this will even lead to the perception often that women who have been given medals have not earned these medals, but have been given them as a sort of form of jewelry. One commonly issued medal, Zaboyevy Zaslugi, for combat services, becomes known as Zapolovoy Zaslugi for sexual services when it's seen on women. So this becomes a issue that happens during the war that also leads to a lot of self-policing. Women are often beaten by girls, and physically, or as women start, and there's a variety of ways in which the women who are policing the line of girls will try to shame women.
I'm glad you specified that language difference there.
Because
it's really interesting.
It's jarring.
Women and girls. Yeah.
And one of the issues that they come with at the end of the war, the commandant of the female sniper school, Colonel Kolchak, who's a man, says towards the end of the war, quote, "The fighting qualities of the girls have been proven and no one can argue with them. But one could pose the question from another point of view. Does the country need such a sacrifice? Because I think that few of these girls will become healthy mothers. If the country needs such a sacrifice, then we need to send them not by the hundreds, but by the thousands. But if this is too costly, then we need to stop and think, end quote. So this idea of if the primary function of women in Soviet society is, in addition to being a worker, also being a mother, and how will these women be able to be mothers after the war, is something that they think about. This is also something that comes up in debates in the U.S. Army as they're integrating women. And this is also complicated by the fact that many of the women who are sent to the front early in the war come back pregnant. And that there is a large number of these women come back pregnant early in the war. Pregnancy also becomes a survival strategy for some people. Some women in the Army talk about their parents writing letters to say you could get pregnant and then you'd be out of harm's way, and I'd have a granddaughter. But others basically refusing to do so. And in 1944, the Soviet state does a few interesting things. It creates a series of motherhood laws that provide more government support for mothers and creates single mothers as a legal category. It taxes people without children or few children, and it makes it illegal to insult mothers, and creates an award known as the Matgaroina, the Mother Heroine Award, that basically for having 7 or more children, you get a medal that has various privileges associated with it. Additionally, it makes it very easy for men to escape paying alimony. You can have, starting in 1944, you no longer have to show the man's name on the birth certificate, which is a way of, they understand that they're going through a demographic crisis. And this is a way for them to kind of move around this, to kind of encourage men to sleep around without consequences, saying that the state will do this. This doesn't really work. There is no baby boom in the post-war Soviet Union because the country is still in ruins, essentially. So
we had a comment from Alan saying there were no condoms in the glorious Red Army. Is that, you said there was not much there for menstruation? So if there's not anything there for normal monthly procedure, then
it's not a regular. This is not like the German Army or the U.S. Army where this is a regularly issued thing. And in general, prophylactics in the Soviet Union were not something that were highly encouraged at this time. Right, in the 1920s they were. But in this time, it's a strongly pronatalist state. Abortion's illegal. This is, just not part of what's going on. So, by the end of the war, in the post-war period, there is often a sense that a sense that women had gone to the front not to fight. In an immediate post-war speech by Mikhail Kalinin, who was technically the president of the Soviet Union, he says, "Don't talk about what you've done. Let us talk about what you've done." This leads to many women being shamed for wearing their uniform or decorations in public. It's also a model that Anna Krylova has shown in her work, where in the post-war period, there's no kind of concept of trauma. There's no kind of concept of using psychology to readapt men to society. There's a model of the caring wife who will tend to the wounded soul. And so the services of women do not fit, while they're occasionally remembered, particularly those who gave their lives during the war, are not really part of they're part of the mythology, but the kind of dealing with the women themselves is not something that the state necessarily wants to highlight all that much. And the fact that there's a huge demographic imbalance means that while the model is to become kind of like a wife and mother, many of them will have the opportunity to become mothers. Fewer of them will have opportunity to become wives, because so many of the marriageable men have died in the course of the war. So that's very briefly about women. And now let me talk a little bit about the non-Russians. And yeah, of course.
The first is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that when you look at the Red Army compared to perhaps the British Army and the American military, is that the distances involved, is that the women in the Red Army can be much further away from, if you like, civilization and headquarters and things like, whereas when we think of all the women who are, for example, in Britain working in the cabinet war rooms under London, there much more organization, much more structure, much more just general military protocol of saluting and holding doors open. So there was less occasions for things to kind of get out of hand. But the nature, I mean, I was reading a book about the Night Witches fairly recently, the nature of them, fairly remote airfields, these commanders being able to take advantage a little bit more easily because there isn't that kind of that immediate kind of military hierarchy around you. Is that something that you would say is true?
Well, I mean, the remoteness is certainly part of it, but also one of the things about Red Army command style, and this is just a general Soviet thing, this is as true as a factory as it is of a regiment, is that this is not a society that is built around laws and protocols as much as it is built around, you deputize someone with an incredible amount of power, and as long as they get the tasks done that they need to get done, you look the other way at anything that's kind of going south about it, right? So if a commander is an effective commander and is taking his objectives, if you're getting complaints from his subordinates about the male subordinates about him punching them, or the female subordinates about him having busy hands, you are likely to look the other way if you are his commander. I mean, that's how I would kind of think about that. So let me talk a little bit about non-Russians. And I'll be super brief in terms of the background stuff that you need to know. But I mean, the Bolsheviks do inherit a multi-ethnic state. They inherit most of the footprint of the Russian Empire. They are an avowedly anti-imperialist state because they believe that imperialism is the ultimate form of capitalism. Now, they'll do imperialist stuff. They'll conquer places that don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. But their overall rhetoric is that we're non-imperialist, we're anti-racist. And they think in terms of nation. And nation is kind of, well, they think of this as this is basically under capitalism, this is the form of government that exists. So you kind of need to build a nation. And Stalin defines the nation as a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychology, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. And basically, they arrive at this concept that things should be socialist in content, national in form. That you will develop nations, even the less developed nations, you will help them flower into the greatest form of that nation they can be in order to feed them socialist content, in order for the nation to ultimately wither away, and also to show that you are not simply an empire. So national languages, literatures are developed and fostered in a lot of ways, but they also believe in a concept of backwardness, where basically under a Marxist framework, you have different nations are at different points along the road to capitalism, socialism, communism, but it's not racialized. The most backward nations are not, it's not like in a racialized society where you believe they're inferior, they'll always be inferior. You believe that all humans have the same basic potential, but that certain people need to go through the stages of history more quickly. So nomadic peoples are considered to be very backwards, versus more urban people are higher on the level of development. And in this framework, Russians are not really the most developed people because they're not the most urbanized. And in this framework, in addition to the concept of nation, you have the concept of class. And of course, for the Bolsheviks, it's a big problem that they come to power in a largely peasant society. So one of the things I want you to keep in mind as I talk about this is a lot of the things that I'll be saying about non-Russians could be true about Russian peasants in a lot of situations, in a lot of contexts.
Right.
So one of the things that they're afraid of in the 20s is also great Russian chauvinism, is that they will, because the party is a largely Russian-speaking organization, and Russians are heavily represented with the party, and often other minorities are not, they're constantly afraid that, are we acting like imperialists without meaning to? Because if you're, a thing to keep in mind as well, if you are a Marxist and if you're a socialist, Leninist, Stalinist, the present is the battle between everything bad in the past and the good things that are coming in the future. So you're always kind of afraid that you have to wash the filth of the past off of yourself, and you're always afraid that you're going to kind of misstep. So nations are supposed to fade away. Class had been their primary category that they had thought about. By 1936, class loses much of its power. well, nations look like they're here to stay for quite some time. So there's all sorts of ways in which national autonomous regions and such are cemented by 1936. Nationality is part of your passport, whereas class is less, they think less and less about class because they believe that they've destroyed class antagonism within their society by 1936. So just to give a sense of where some of the background on this. So I want to remind folks, remember that the Nazis view World War II as a race war, and which they will eliminate Jews and either eliminate or enslave the Slavs. They're viewing the settlement of the American West as the model of what they want to do in the territory of the Soviet Union. They're very explicit about this. And while they will retreat from some of these, their fundamental idea is that the Soviet Union as a non-racially based society is basically they use this term a lot, geographical understanding that will collapse immediately as soon as you knock down the door. And one of the things to keep in mind as well is that the Nazis, and this will become important towards the end of today's talk, the Nazis, because they view things in racial categories, when they occupy areas, they'll often only give one group the opportunity to collaborate with them and play groups off of each other. In Czechoslovakia, they'll work more with the Slovaks and the Czechs. In Crimea and the Soviet Union, essentially Crimean Tatars are the only people who are allowed to work with them. And this will lead to high numbers of Crimean Tatars working with the Nazis because the Nazis have the resources to survive, and this will lead to massive deportations towards the end of the war, something I'll get to. So the Soviets like to play up the idea that the Nazis are kind of afraid of the wild, savage peoples of the Soviet Union, and the Nazis are very confused by how diverse the Soviet people are, and that they can keep it together. But one of the big stories of the war that I want us to keep in mind is that in many ways, this idea of shifting from class to nationality is one of the big stories of the war. And the conflation of Russian and Soviet is one of the big stories of the war, which means that you don't necessarily have to be ethnically Russian, but you have to speak Russian. You have to be immersed in Russian culture in the course of the war. This starts before the war, but I'll talk a little bit about how that works.
So Russian in ideology, in a sense, Russian in your attitude, as opposed to Russian by your birth.
Yeah, think of it as German in the Habsburg Empire, right?
Yeah,
it's you can be whoever, but you have to be now part of this cultural program. And just very quickly, just to give a sense of the home front, one of the things that happens on the two interesting things happen on the home front. On the one hand, many party cadres from the more remote regions of the Soviet Union end up in the army, which leads to a retreat of the party in many places and a return to lots of traditional things like circumcision, polygamy, stuff like that in some areas. But then you also have the hinterland becoming much more important as factories and mining and all sorts of other stuff that had been underdeveloped there becomes very significant during the war because they've lost most of their most developed areas. And also hundreds of thousands of people from the European part of the Soviet Union get evacuated to the peripheries in Central Asia and the Caucasus and so on and so forth. So let me talk a little bit about the army. Stalin is convinced that he has bought himself significantly more time than he has. And the Red Army is in the midst of massive reorganization of all sorts of different things. And from their gear setup to their standard weapons to also how are they going to manage diversity. So remember that the Soviet Union is anti-colonial, anti-imperial. So they don't have a segregated army like the US. They don't have an army that is a colonial army like the UK or France, where you just kind of set it this way. They had territorial units until 1938, but they do away with that because they want the military to be an all-union organization that brings everyone together. And it should be said that the Red Army was key to turning peasants into loyal Soviet citizens before this. So this is one of the key institutions, and they're integrating non-Russians more and more in the pre-war period. Now, I should probably define why do I keep saying non-Russians? It's a really awkward term. The Russian is младшие командиры и бойцы нерусской национальности, which translates as junior commanders and fighters of non-Russian nationality. It's in the singular. And I'm going to start off by saying who it basically doesn't include. It doesn't include Ukrainians, it doesn't include Belarusians, and it doesn't include Jews, because these people are more integrated. It doesn't really include Latvians, Lithuanians, or Estonians, because they'll all have their own military divisions based on the parts of the pre-annexation militaries that the Soviet Union finds to be loyal enough to use. This refers to a huge swath of people from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, from Siberia, from autonomous regions of Russia and Ukraine. And it's partially about culture, but it is primarily about language. Because what the issue here is, like, in many ways, if you're an urban Tatar, you are probably more integrated in the Soviet project and you almost certainly speak Russian, versus if you are a Russian peasant from the middle of nowhere, you actually probably are less integrated in the Soviet project, but at least you speak Russian, so the propaganda can work on you. This is primarily about language. And one of the things that is kind of shocking is that Russian became a subject that was only required in all Soviet schools in 1938, which means that if you are my age, you grew up, in a village in Georgia, you would not have gotten an education in Russian, unless they happened to be teaching it there, but they would not be required to do so. So what this means is that the vast majority of people at draft age do not have Russian language skills. And before the war, this was dealt with initially by territorial units, and then by the idea that, okay, the military service is several years, you take some time to integrate people to learn the language, so on and so forth. During the war, this becomes a huge issue. And there's a brief return of ethnic units in 1941 and 1942, simply because they need to organize units very, very quickly. And basically on the Narodnaya Opolchenia system, the home guard system, they happen to develop units that tend to be not by design, but just by the fact that they're recruiting from a certain area. There's an overwhelmingly Armenian unit. There's a couple of overwhelmingly Kazakh units, Kalmyk units, so on and so forth. And some of these units get destroyed. Some of them do very, very well. And have patronage relationships with the local governments wherever they're from. One of the first guards divisions in the Red Army, these are elite units that are formed in the fall of 1941 on, is the 8th Guards Rifle Division, which had been the 316th Rifle Division, which is primarily Kazakh and Kyrgyz. And one of the first major war heroes is this guy, Badjan Mamishuli, who will be kind of the co-author of one of the first major novels to emerge from the war, which he states is just a memoir, but his co-author says is a novel, and will at times be brought in as the greatest expert on soldierly psychology that the war produces, but at times will be treated as kind of a savage or as a nationalist. So there's always this tension here. So Russian is always the language of command in the Red Army, and it is a language of instruction. So the official program developed in September of 1941 is 1 month. So you can imagine, if you do not speak Russian and are learning Russian and have 1 month to master digging trenches, running in ways that will not get you killed, and using your weapon, how successful that's going to be. And this has predictable results. By the spring of 1942, there are multiple reports of serious issues with non-Russian soldiers. Higher rates of desertion, higher rates of self-mutilation, which is shooting yourself in the hand to get out of service, which is a capital offense in the Red Army. If other armies, you just kind of get in trouble, but you get executed for that in the Red Army. And of soldiers who just don't understand what's going on. They're isolated. They don't know. Soldiers from Kazakhstan who don't know, is Kazakhstan under German occupation right now? Soldiers who can't write to their families because they don't know how to write addresses in Russian. You could write in any language, but you had to write the address in Russian. Soldiers who really just don't understand the consequences of their actions and the power that the state has over them. So basically, you have these issues. You have other cultural issues. One I want to point out very quickly, that the primary protein of the Red Army is pork, and many of these soldiers are Muslim. So you have an issue of many of them either refusing to eat pork or getting sick if they eat pork. Conversely, between 1941 and 1943, there's a huge problem with meat in the Red Army, and many of these guys who come from societies where it's normal to eat horse will teach their Slavic comrades how to eat horse. You have an issue with vodka. If you have a unit that is made up of a third Uzbeks who refuse to drink, and they give that alcohol to their Russian comrades, that becomes a problem, because they're dosing they're trying to dose the alcohol in a way that would get people buzzed but not drunk. And also the culture of, they want tea drinking is a huge thing among these folks. So sometimes on local initiatives, they'll set up tea huts for the Central Asian soldiers to kind of hang out in. So negative attitudes start to be expressed in 1942. The terms Yoldash, which means comrade in several Turkic languages, Yusupi, which is a common name, or Natsmen, which is just Natsmenshinstvo, national minority, are thrown around. Some commanders literally are caught saying that they look forward to high casualties so they can get a new batch of recruits who they hope will be Slavic. And some political officers are writing to various republics saying, listen, we got a bunch of guys from your republic. They're depressed. They have no idea what's going on. Send us some newspapers, send us some musical instruments, send us some literature. We need help. And so eventually in September of 1942, the political director of the Red Army issues a major corrective remedy that basically says, listen, you've been ignoring these guys. They don't know the language, and you need to start serving them. So it sets up several things. The special political officers who are there to serve the needs of non-Russians. They often act as translators and language teachers, and will maintain libraries of literature in various languages to serve these guys. A print network of propaganda and newspapers to be distributed to non-Russian soldiers. Promoting stories of heroism by ethnic minorities. Promoting stories of the heroic past of ethnic minorities. And publishing statistics about medals earned by ethnic group. This is something they do every couple of months. They'll say, these are number of thousands of Uzbeks who have gotten medals. They will increase emphasis on connection with home and frame the war in traditional terms for many of these groups, and also encourage any sort of rituals from various societies that they feel will be good for morale, whether that's blood brotherhood in the Caucasus, the cult of weapons in the Caucasus, allowing Muslim burials to happen among Muslim soldiers. They do all this. So
just to jump in with a question or comment, really, because it's interesting for September 1942, because I don't want to kind of bring it to a specific turning point. I don't like turning points as a reference anyway, but 1942 is the slump period, I would call it, for the Red Army. Okay, yes, they've stopped the advance on Moscow. They've kind of, Barbarossa has come to an end, but it's not the beginning of the up climb yet. It's not the beginning of the operations we would think of later in the war, Bagration, things like that. So it's interesting that this difficulty they've recognized with the language training, with the connection there. Is it out of genuinely recognizing there's a problem, or is it also born out of desperation that they really need more people by now? This is the time the Red Army needs that.
I mean, that's one and the same thing. I mean, if we think about September of 1942, it looks very possible that the Red Army is not going to hold Stalingrad.
Yeah, it's critically good.
It has not been decided yet, and it does not look good at this point, right? The Caucasus look like they might fall at this point, right? It really looks like the Germans might get to Baku. If the Germans get to Baku, it's difficult to imagine how the Red Army wins the war after that. So we have a situation in which it really looks like everything's over. And
just a quick question from a viewer there, because you mentioned the Muslims there. Benjamin Allen is saying, what exactly was the relationship between the Stalinist state and religion before the war? Because Marxist-Leninists are supposed to be atheists, but you have the presence of Muslims. Was there a policy?
So officially it's separation of church and state,
Right.
officially, right? Which where they're saying we do not, we just don't recognize religion, but we don't persecute religion. In practice, it is persecution of religion that, well, they'll do things like, they confiscate a lot of property of churches and mosques and synagogues and so on and so forth. They tax some parishes out of existence. They'll close places by saying this is a fire hazard and it's not safe for Soviet people to be here. And then at various points, like during collectivization, during the Great Terror, they will decapitate religious leadership. A large number of priests are killed during the Civil War. A large number of priests are arrested as resisting collectivization during, and this includes mullahs, and this includes, religious leaders. I'll just say religious leaders. And then a large number of religious leaders are executed during the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. So, while they're officially just not recognizing religion, they are basically at war with religion. And the interesting thing that happens is in 1943, there is a detente with religion. In part, this is a response to allies pressuring them, but in part, this is a desire to kind of just bring, to mobilize any form of.
It's the desperation again.
The desperation, and they also, they know they can control it, so they reconstitute the synod of the Orthodox Church. They reconstitute various muftiates. And while they never explicitly say we're okay with religion now, there are various signals sent to political workers that you can make, like, we don't like religion, but you're not going to go ride guys too hard if they're praying, and so on and so forth.
Kind of like decriminalized rather than illegal.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Yeah, it's like, if you've got an ounce of crosses, then it's okay. If you've got 20 ounces of crosses, then you're in trouble. I
can't believe that we're comparing religion to cannabis, but it seems to work quite well. Yeah.
Well, for them, it's opium. So,
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
So there's a series. So one of the things that I've written about, and I'll be really quick about this, is a series of letters known as the Nakaz Naroda, the People's Instructions, that is part of this campaign of propaganda aimed specifically at the non-Russians, and they frame the goals of the war in terms of particular religious groups. So Armenians, they mentioned the Armenian genocide. Uzbeks, they call it 1915 because the genocide didn't exist as a term yet, right? But they talk about 1915. Uzbeks, they explicitly at one point they do actually explicitly talk about Islam. And they talk about how, well, basically your towns will be turned into brothels. It's a very patriarchal society. So they really play up you will lose control of the women in your society. They evoke a heroic past, and they eventually they basically send the message that to be a good Uzbek, Tatar, Armenian, Georgian, whoever, you must also be a good soldier in the Red Army, that the interests of the Red Army are the interests of your people. And by August 1943, there's a large conference of political workers who are working among the non-Russians, and they basically say, guys, I think we've figured it out. There's a lot of spreading of information of what has worked, but from then on, they view this as essentially a problem to be managed rather than a critical thing. And there really is the message that, okay, the friendship of the peoples, the concept of how the Soviet Union how the multinational aspects of the Soviet Union worked, has served us well, and that it's continued in the war, and the war has shown that we are prepared to defend each other. So there are some problems that continue with this, though, in that the Red Army usually does not have stable cadres in a unit. So you might have a unit that's 30% Uzbek this month, goes into a major offensive, and now it's 5% Uzbek, and now it's 20% Armenian. By the way, all these statistics are military secrets, and it's relatively rare that you get a picture into what the ethnic makeup of a unit was, unless it was famously of one nationality. So they might send newspapers that people can't read. Oftentimes I can't distinguish between Armenian and Georgian, and they would run into problems where there's a bunch of Armenians in this unit, and you send us a bunch of Georgian newspapers that they can't read, right? So this is a problem that comes up. But by and large, they start really emphasizing that in the last few classes of school, people who are about to be drafted, they really need to bone up on their Russian. By and large, bearing witness to terrible things that the Germans had done, particularly in 1943 and 44, convinced people that this is a war that's worth fighting. The kind of 1945 moment that the Allies have when they liberate concentration camps, that in the Red Army basically starts from the winter of 1941 on, and the military really makes a point of demonstrating, of having soldiers come and bear witness. And ultimately, going abroad will bring these soldiers together. Now, I'm going to try to wrap up so we can go to more just question and answer stuff by just talking briefly about a few other things. Towards the end of the war, they're dealing with soldiers that they refer to as Western soldiers. These are soldiers from areas annexed by the Soviet Union on the eve of the war that really had not been exposed to Soviet way of being for a long time. And there's some similarities there, but many of them are Ukrainian or Belarusian. So the issue is more politics than language, although they also have a very large number of Moldovans at the end of the war, and their language is an issue as well. The flip side, I was going to talk about religion, but we already talked about it. So the flip side of this celebration of the friendship of the peoples and the idea that it worked is a new category of people that emerged during the war, known as the Traitor Nations. So there are whole categories, whole nationalities that are deported in the course of the war. Beginning in 1941, by the hundreds of thousands, Germans, Finns, Hungarians, and Greeks are deported preventatively because it's feared that they might collaborate with the Germans if they are on territory that the Germans occupy. And these are not, these are people who've been living there for generations. These are long-term diaspora. These are not people who showed up yesterday. Some of them are allowed to serve in the labor army, which is a terrible, terrible place to serve. These are seen as preventative and prophylactic, but beginning in late 1943, there are basically these revenge deportations where entire ethnic groups that are considered to have collaborated with the Germans are deported. The first are the Karachay in the North Caucasus. Later, this will include Kalmyks, the Chechens, English, and Crimean Tatars. And this poster is the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. And if you were a Red Army soldier of one of these nationalities, you were almost certainly going to be deported with everyone else. You were going to be taken from the ranks of the Red Army and sent to, many of these people end up in, depending on the ethnic group, many of them end up in Uzbekistan, some of them end up in Kazakhstan, some of them end up in Siberia. They have their property taken away. The streets are renamed. In the case of the Chechens, gravestones are recycled. And there's literally tens of thousands of troops who are involved in these deportations. You could be a highly decorated Red Army soldier, you would still get deported. I've run into a couple soldiers who managed to not get deported for various reasons, and for reasons that remain unclear, but just like there's mentions of them after this happens. And hundreds of thousands of people will die as a result of this, not because that's a goal. This is not, these aren't the Nazis who just want these people to die, because the end goal is for these nations to disappear, but not through physical destruction. The idea is that, okay, we send the Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan, they will eventually marry Uzbeks and become essentially Uzbek, and that will be that. This doesn't happen because people do not want to marry people from these groups, not just because of potential buying into the idea that they're all traitors, but also because if you have a kid with that person, that kid, the status of being a traitor nation person is going to fall onto your kid. So, again, many people die because they do not really set up the infrastructure. This is common. This same thing happens during decolonization, during collectivization, right? Where they just kind of are sending people often into the middle of nowhere, often in seasons when there's not the seasons you want to be doing this, often fall or spring, and people have to kind of make their own living. And eventually some of these groups are allowed to return, some are not. Some are allowed to return under Khrushchev, some are allowed to return under Brezhnev, some are only allowed to return after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So very last thing I want to talk about is...
So just to double check.
Sure.
So in that era we talked about as the desperate era, they are bringing in everybody they can. So 42. So you could have been from one of these places in 42 in the Red Army. You've been trained. You're in a division, and then before you're now no longer wanted, and you're part of this deported. So now the pressure's off, because by 44 the Russian steamroller is on its way towards Berlin. They can now do things they couldn't have possibly done 2 years ago because they were too desperate. Yeah,
but they still have a desperate manpower shortage. Right?
Yeah,
and this is one of the interesting things about, if you look at Red Army units in the last year of the war, they're keeping armor and artillery at more or less full strength, and infantry units are constantly understaffed, and this is a constant problem. There's a joke that 2 Russians make a front.
Yeah.
Because of how skeletal some of the organizations
they're desperate in a personnel sense, but they're not desperate in a strategic sense. The outcome is now clearer on the ground. So
the question is, where will the post-war borders be at that point? Not with the war. Yeah.
Okay.
So just two other things I want to talk about is just the kind of the rise of the conflation of Russian and Soviet, and what that means for the non-Russians, and what that means in the course of the war. So part of this mobilization of the past is looking for figures from the heroic past. And one figure who comes up a lot is Idige, who was a medieval steppe warlord who is popular in a variety of Turkic languages. And there's supposed to be this kind of like a large edition of the Idige epos that's supposed to come out in 1944, and then they kind of look back and they say, Idige he sacked some Russian cities and he fought against Russians. That doesn't work. And there's a pushback in 44 against history of Kazakhstan that is written, that basically talks about Russian imperialism in Kazakhstan. And there's a pushback against propaganda that says, well, these people are brave because it's in their blood. They're like, no, these people are brave because they've been raised by the Soviet Union. So increasingly, there's an idea that Russians are the first among equals, and that's coined before the war, but that takes off during the war. That there's a great Russian people, that Russians actually they've always been the avant-garde of history. So in many ways, we see a displacement from class to a particular nationality. Now, keep in mind, the guy who runs the country, the dictator of the country, is not a Russian who's doing this. He's Georgian. Yeah. He speaks with a marked Georgian accent, right? But there is increasingly a sense that the Russians have brought things forward. There is a return to Russian imperial symbols. If we look at this guy, Bato Damchev, who I've written an article about, he's wearing pagoni, which were the shoulder boards that were ripped off of Russian army officers during the revolution and during the Civil War, and which were brought back in 1943 as part of this idea of the Soviet Union is actually the inheritor of everything good from the old regime. And all sorts of great Russian figures are brought back in, have medals named after them that are issued during the war. By 1944, Georgy Lamidze, who is himself an ethnic Georgian propagandist of the Red Army, will say, quote, "A Soviet warrior of any nationality proudly calls himself a Russian soldier. The word Russian has become a symbol of friendship, strength, courage, and victory." This is because Russian is the language of instruction in the army, the language of command in the army, and the language of international communication in the Soviet Union more generally. And later in the war, many non-Russian soldiers will start writing home in Russian because it's the language they use all the time, and because they understand that their letters will get through censorship much more quickly if they write in Russian than if they write in Kyrgyz or Tatar or whatever. So the war ends up being a very important moment of bringing people together, because as Red Army soldiers go abroad, whoever they are in terms of their nationality, everyone sees them as Russians. And in my other work, this isn't something I talked much about today, but one of the things that becomes clear is that they see that there's more, that they have more in common with each other than they do with the Germans or the Romanians, right? Or the Germans or the Hungarians very often, right? The various Axis countries that they go through, they're like, these people are rich, but they're kind of awful. And we come from a society that seems much more fair is often the message that they get both from the political department and also just from their own lived experience. So the war, becomes a key moment in redefining who's in and who's out, redefining hierarchies. Class doesn't really seem to matter anymore. Gender, we're seeing a kind of a much more patriarchal society by the end of the war in many ways, in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of what's actually going on. There are not that many men around, so women are actually doing much of the work. But we have a kind of a return to many forms of tradition that put both women and non-Russians in a kind of an interesting space where, there's no discussion of revolutionary change anymore. There's a sense that the revolution has happened, and what the revolution did is it unleashed the potential of people who were already great before the revolution, that it has created a much more just society, and it's created a society that was strong enough to defeat fascism. But that now clearly Russians are on top, and now clearly, men will be explicitly in the driver's seat in a lot of ways. So I'll leave it there and just open it up to questions. That's basically most of what I wanted to say. I hope this has been informative and been somewhat coherent. And yeah.
No, definitely. And I'll open up the questions from the viewers. But my first comment is really about labeling. And I'm thinking that had I done this show with you, let's say the end of last year, my questions will be different than they are now, inevitably, because of the situation in the world today.
Yeah, of course, yeah. February changed everything.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that the people I have on the and David Stahl and people like that who talk about the fronts and the campaigns and the tank engagements, things like that, the operation. That's all interesting, and obviously you read those kind of books yourself. But the labeling, I guess, for someone like yourself who understands the makeup of these units, the labeling of how complicated it is to refer to a Russian unit, because is it Russian by form? Is it Russian by ideology? Is it Russian by fitting in? The unit that's got to better understand the language at the end of the war, because you said there about the education programs of speeding up the language thing. It must frustrate you reading books where labels are too simplistic.
Well, I mean, this is in my teaching. This is always an interesting thing, is the kind of spending a significant amount of time talking about the difference between Russian and Soviet when you get to World War II, and then pointing out that during World War II, there's a reason why we confuse these things, and part of it does have to do with shifts that happened during World War II, right? That there and so there's a part of me that is very much like, well, this the 8th Guards Rifle Division was at various points probably majority not Russian, but it's part of the Red Army, and everyone spoke Russian. So there's, it becomes a type of thing where it used to frustrate me, but at this point it's just kind of a thing that I accept, and it is a product of this history to a certain extent.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm also thinking, what next? I mean, this has been a fascinating examination, and I really appreciate what you're doing and trying to examine what exactly constitutes the Red Army. But how will this help our study of the Eastern Front? How will it help our study of the Red Army's successes? Because we talk a lot about how on this channel we don't talk about, is it the T-34, is it the Tiger, is it the so and so. We look about the fine line between victory and defeat in so many major campaigns, and I'm thinking that actually when we talk about the Eastern Front in terms of the military side of things, that the motivation and morale levels of a unit, if they're feeling isolated, if they're feeling they don't know what's going on, is something that's contributing to their ability in the field. It's affecting the enemy who are facing them in terms of what prisoners they're capturing and things like that. And I think there's more study to be done on what impact this had on the outcome of the battles. This crazy mix of peoples.
Yeah, and so one of the major sources that I work with is the Commission for the what's generally referred to as the Minsk Commission. It's the Russian Institute of History at the Russian Academy of Sciences commission for the Chronicle of the Second World War is a rough translation, and it was historians who were sent to the front during the war, who were interviewing people, and it's clear at certain points that they're just trying to figure, in the more desperate points in 42 and 43, they're just trying to figure out what works. And in the Stalingrad files, there are significant number of people who basically say, yeah, this propaganda campaign with the non-Russians, it worked really well. It motivated people very strongly. Just providing somebody with letters in their native language, or finding people who could talk to them in their native language, led to a significant shift from guys who were unmotivated and also just didn't know what the hell was going on, to guys who were actually quite motivated. And they're all dead now, but this was often the thing. It's like, yeah, that was back in November, and these people are being interviewed in like February. It's like, yeah, like almost all those people are dead now, but they died bravely rather than submitting to the enemy or something like that. So it does seem to have been quite, by the political department's own reckoning, it was highly effective. Now, of course, right, they're keeping score on themselves. So to what extent, but they are also examining failures. They are looking for failures, right? One of the interesting things about the Red Army, and I'm doing a comparative project with the U.S. Army right now. One of the interesting things about, especially like reading U.S. stuff around alongside Red Army stuff, is that the U.S. Army, when they want to know something, they just have an opinion poll. In the Red Army, you can't do that. So their primary means of getting information are various people who are essentially spying on people, are reading soldiers' mail. And so the political apparatus and the secret police are essentially the primary forms of gathering information about how soldiers feel about things. And there is from what I gather from the limited information that I have, issues of international of issues of various nationalities not getting along, not something that people are writing that much about in 43, 44, 45. Definitely something that comes up a fair amount in 40, particularly in 42. 41 seems less so. There's a little bit in 41, later 41, but the thing to keep in mind is that many of the people from these minority groups that would be at the front in 1941 were the most motivated people, the party members who would have volunteered.
Yeah.
So, and the most integrated people, also importantly, most integrated people would actually speak Russian.
Great. So we'll do a couple of questions. The first from Andres there, but I'm going to expand it a bit. Is there data about how Red Army women soldiers were treated as POWs, but I can say also non-Russians as POWs? Is there a marked difference in how the Germans treated them or the Axis treated them?
Mm-hmm. So I don't have data on this, but the standard kind of story that you often hear is that Germans often would rape and kill Red Army women who they found, because for them the idea of a woman in uniform was indirectly in combat was just so jarring. And this also goes back to the Germans, the German Civil War that takes place in 1918, 1919, or 1990, basically, like the Freikorps units versus communist units. This image of the dangerous woman who needs to be destroyed was a part of the right-wing imaginary in Germany, going back to before the Third Reich. There are other accounts of women who were taken prisoner and just abused. The thing to keep in mind is that, remember that in 1941, when the Wehrmacht goes into the Soviet Union, they do not have a plan for what they're going to do with prisoners. And what they often do, and what they often do is just have these large barbed wire enclosures and let people starve to death. Now, what happens as the war goes on, and as it becomes clear that the basically completely genocidal plan of let's just basically destroy the entire population of the Soviet Union, by late 1941, it becomes clear that's not going to work anymore. So in 42 and 43, they start trying to recruit people, and they'll often do this on a national basis. So there is a fascinating story of the Legion Ural, which was a Tatar and Bashkir unit organized by the Wehrmacht as a legion to fight against this, to basically fight against partisans. They were called Idel Ural because that was the republic that existed during the Civil War. That was the Tatar Bashkir Republic. This is Central Russia. And the interesting thing that happens is a lot of these guys are from the Second Shock Army that is captured. That's Vlasov's army that is captured, and will lead to the Vlasovite movement. And what happens is there are 3 battalions that are organized to train in Poland. One is sent to Belarus. They immediately kill their German handlers and go over to the side of the Belarusian partisans. One is sent to France. They immediately kill the German advisors and go over to the side of the French partisans. The other one's in Poland, and they're just kind of disbanded. And there are several members of the Tatar intelligentsia who were clearly kind of leading this conspiracy, many of whom were executed in 1945. So we see here an interesting thing where, on the one hand, the Germans have this idea of we want to put everyone in their racial categories. We'll organize our units by racial categories, and we'll also send them to fight people who are of a different group. Right? They send them to France and they send them to Belarus. But in many cases, this idea of Soviet internationalism or hatred of fascism is much stronger than this racialized thing. Now, on the other plane, of course, the Georgian Uprising in 45, but I mean, there are in other cases, there were some of these legions did actually fight. Some of these legions fought until the end of the war. So it does, it varies from place to place, but to basically put kind of a period on it. One other thing, the Germans are obsessed with taking pictures of Asian-looking POWs in 1941 because it proves their kind of idea of Russia, of the Soviet Union as a non-European Asiatic state,
of course,
filled with racial others. Just like they like to take pictures of Senegalese prisoners in France in 1940. There's this kind of idea of racial degradation that is so important to the Nazis. So, I mean, it does matter to a certain extent what ethnic group you're a part of in terms of your ability to get out, what national group you're a part of, in terms of your ability to get out of being a prisoner of war, which, remember, 2/3 of Soviet prisoners of war die. So, that your chances, well, if you're a Jew, you have no chance. If you're a Russian, you're somewhere in between. If you're Ukrainian, you have a pretty good chance, and various other ethnic groups, that's what they do. And one thing that is interesting now, and then we'll move on to the next question. I know of at least one Jewish guy who was from Crimea, who just pretended to be a Crimean Tatar, and that's how he survived being a prisoner of war. That also explained him being circumcised, because the Germans would often just pull down soldiers' pants and execute anyone who's circumcised in the first year of the war. Later on, they figure out that Muslims are also often circumcised, and they don't want to alienate them, so they kind of stopped doing that.
So that it changes as the war goes on. I think is it's not like any of these things is set.
It's all moving, and it's all There's an irony where one of the most cosmopolitan militaries at the end of the war is the SS, which is supposed to be all about racial purity, but it's easier to recruit minorities. It's easier to recruit non-Germans into the SS and the Wehrmacht. So it becomes you have just this incredible range of people who are serving in the SS at the end of the war.
That's a good point. Yeah, French SS in Paris, in Berlin, and what have you. Right. One more question from the Commissar. Interesting name there. Thank you, Brandon. Love the stuff about of soldiers, by the way. Did lots of, and I'm going to change it to your language, girls returning from the war try to conceal their service because of the prejudice against the women?
So the standard story is that until about Brezhnev, there's a strong tendency to hide this service because of fear of kind of being snickered at or sneered at, and it's like, we know what you were doing at the front. And there's a film that comes out called The Belarusian Station, which comes out. It's about several veterans meeting, one of whom was one of these mobile field wives, and it kind of returns dignity to the character of the mobile field wife, and the fact that this film was allowed to be made is sort of a signal. So there does seem, there is women who were interviewed about this in oral history projects. There's a great interview with Vera Malachova, who was a surgeon during the war, where she describes, like, basically, and for about 20 years after the war, you didn't talk about it, and then it was something that you could be proud of again. And this has to do with political shifts within the Soviet Union more broadly. Under Brezhnev, the cult of the war comes back in lots of ways, and you could talk about the war in ways that you couldn't necessarily talk about in earlier generations.
Well, that's been reflected in the films. I mean, when you talked earlier about the kind of the non-sexualization of the imageries and the posters. I mean, I'm thinking of those kind of movies made in the late 40s in Russia, about Stalingrad and the one, the Flight Part 1 and things like that. The women are all dressed. You hardly can tell the difference between women and men, and there's no relation. Now, I mean, for example, the recent-ish movie about Pavlichenko, the sniper, there was lots of romance in that. So now, modern cinema is kind of inserting back in the romance, and also not necessarily the romance, the negative side of the relationship between men and women are kind of being are in the modern cinema now. So even its portrayal on screen has kind of shifted with the times, and presumably will shift again. So that's the interesting thing, is where will we be in 10 years' time in terms of talking about labels of Red Army, Soviet, Russian, all these labels. We have a distinction, a classification for them today, but that classification is going to be morphing all the time because of current affairs. So,
and obviously, since February, everything looks different, right? I mean, there is that distinct possibility that we just lived through the first 2 months of World War III and haven't yet realized it. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I can see it's strangely a rise in books in the future about specifically about non-Russian units in World War II, and them selling better than they perhaps would have done a few years ago. It's fascinating how
I want to point out something really uncomfortable that I just realized, which is that this concept that Ukrainians are not part of the non-Russians is so on message for what's going on right now, right? This idea, of course, they're just another form of Russian, which is an old imperial idea anyway. But I mean, and again, I'm not endorsing this view, but this is quite interesting that that all the way back to 1941, you can see when there was this idea that, like, okay, of course the Ukrainians are a distinct nation, and we put a lot of effort into that. They're still kind of like close enough that when you come up with this term "Neruski," it doesn't really include Ukrainians.
No, fascinating. I think on that note, we'll leave it there. So I'm just going to I'm going to drop you out of the screen for a second, remind you what we've got coming up tomorrow. So tomorrow, folks, we have another show. We have Scott Sheffield coming on, talking about Canada's First Nations or First Peoples, Indigenous, whichever term. Again, it's all about language and terminology and labels, but we're talking about that. That'll be a fascinating. And then Friday, we're looking at the organization of the Indian Army in World War II, which I'm particularly looking forward to. And I'm hoping that will start as a sort of springboard for other shows, looking at some deeper dives in the Indian Army, because if we're talking about units that fought all over the theaters, the Indian Army certainly did so, and the 14th Army in Burma is, I think, the unit I am most fascinated by in World War II, because it is just a complete smorgasbord of all sorts of nations and cultures and language and colors, and it's just fascinating. So we're talking about the Indian Army. But right now, I'm going to bring Brandon back in, basically just to say goodbye, really. So it's been great talking to you. I'll remind people again, your book is available. The link to purchase it is in the description below, or you can buy it at any of your local booksellers or internet retailers. What are you working on now? Anything that you're planning now? Is politics shifting where your focus is?
So right now I am working on a book-length project comparing chaplains in the U.S. Army with political workers in the Red Army during the Second World War, tentatively titled "The Search for Salvation in the Second World War." So the idea is essentially to look at how an illiberal dictatorship and a liberal democracy both dealt with the existential issues of war, and both sent specialists who were embedded among soldiers to kind of inspire them and deal with, questions from, well, what do I do that my wife has just left me? to what are we fighting for, to how do I interpret the death of my friend, and all these sorts of things. So that's what I'm working on now. And I just want to thank everyone so much for listening to this. Thank you for all your comments. I'm really bad at keeping track of side comments myself.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting sidebar. A lot of it was just kind of people making comments to each other, which is fascinating. And I appreciate the fact we've got people from different countries watching, in Poland and Germany and USA and Canada and Britain. And it's always interesting. And some days I go back and actually just read all the sidebar because I'm trying to listen to you, think about what the comments are coming in and everything else, and it's fascinating, the conversations. But it's been brilliant. So folks, thank you for your attention today, and I definitely will be inviting Brandon back in the future, because that what you just talked about there really is of interest to me. I'm fascinated by the whole how religion and motivation and ideology sits with not just the nation we know of, but we talk about German and Aryan Nazi ideology, but of course the Allies have their own ideology they're fighting. One of my things I always thought about is, why do people run up an invasion beach? Is they enlist for one reason, but they may fight for a different reason, and I think that's that examination of why people fight and moral dilemmas is worth discussing. So we'll have you back on for that. But right now, I'm going to say thank you very much, everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow at the same time for our look at the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. Goodbye, everybody. Cheers.
Have a lovely day, everyone.